the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, Episode 10.
Welcome to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R Squared Global.
Thanks for tuning in, guys. I'm your host, Ryan Ray. So good to have you on this edition of the Global Energy Leaders Podcast. Great show today. We have on Aaron Drucker talking about the difference between state and non-state owned energy companies. And so there's a lot of meat here to dig into. I won't keep you very long today. Just a quick reminder, check out the show notes for everything you need to know. The giveaway is still going on, so rate and review in iTunes for your chance to win the book from Dr. Andrew Inkpen from a few episodes ago. Also, everything else we've been talking about, trip to Africa, article in RWA, that's all there. We'd love to hear your feedback. But finally, before we get to Aaron, I want to point out one thing. I want to mention our listeners in Australia, and I keep seeing bigger and bigger numbers out of Australia, and I love it. Thank you guys so much. I would love to hear from you and see what we can do to add value to you guys because you're part of the global community. And so shoot me an email, globalenergyleaders@gmail.com, and hopefully we can connect. As I mentioned, Aaron Drucker's on today. We're talking about state-owned versus not state-owned energy companies. You can find his full bio in the show notes, and everything we discuss and link to will be in the show notes. Without further ado, here is Aaron. Well, Aaron, we've been talking on the show the past month really about the differences in government versus privately owned companies. And so I've been looking for a guest, and I found one, I believe in yourself, who could come on and really help us through this issue. Thank you so much for your time today. How is it going?
It's going great. It's going great, Ryan. Thanks for having me. The discussion on national oil companies versus privately owned oil companies is definitely interesting. Definitely a lot of differences and similarities depending on which region of the world you're working in.
Okay, so let's just kind of set the table. What nations have you worked in so we can kind of frame the questions around that?
Sure. So I've worked in Peru, Australia, Japan, Singapore, and then I've worked on projects. I wasn't local to the country, but I've worked on projects that were built in Colombia and Mozambique.
Okay, and then obviously you've worked on stuff here in the States as well. So you've kind of got the full gamut there of not only the different types of government entities that would own these companies, also different cultures that would be involved. And so let's just start there. Let's go to South America. What did you see in Peru? Because there's a lot of talk right now, as you know, with the what I'm thinking is the beginning of the end of OPEC, and so you're seeing a lot of problems in Venezuela, and then South America in general has been struggling the past decade. What was it like working in Peru, and how was it working with a government-owned entity there?
So Peru is a great country. They're in my experience, they're a lot different in the way that they function from Venezuela and Colombia. Peru is slowly becoming their economy is slowly becoming more free market, kind of since the late 80s, early 90s. And when I was there, certainly the country felt more like a free market. And the involvement of the national oil company there was really confined to a commercial partner role, meaning that they were getting profits from the specific project that I was working on, the Peru LNG project, but they really weren't taking any responsibility for operations of the facility, and that's fairly a typical role for them. They don't get involved in the operations. What they will do is that Peru has laws that require Western companies, when they come in, to have a certain percentage of national content in their contracts. So you'll have a certain percentage of all your POs and all of your subcontracts that have to be by dollar value with local suppliers and local subcontractors. And then on top of that, you'll have a certain percentage of your total workforce, both project management staff and construction management staff, and craft labor that will have to be local content.
Well, let's talk about the local content aspect real quick. When you're going through this process in Peru or wherever it may be, and you're bringing on locals, do they have the experience, or is there a training phase that you have to bring them up to speed on, or what is that like?
Sure. So again, that of course varies from country to country. In the specific case of Peru, craft labor, most of it was trained. You'll have some skilled craft labor resident in the country, but for instance, in Peru, out of a workforce of around 4,800 people on site or so, we trained. I want to say it was something close to 2,500 Peruvians. So that's training anywhere from carpenters to welding to boilermakers to electricians. So all of the various crafts. So that obviously takes quite a bit of time and lots of resources, and you have to include for all of that both in your initial estimate for the project and with your planning and your scheduling.
Let's transition to what is the most difficult country that you've had to work in as far as having a state-owned energy entity?
Probably Colombia. Colombia was harder because Colombia actually has an old oil and gas industry. You actually did have people there that were trained, but it was heavily unionized, and there were a lot more restrictions with who we could train and how we could train them, and the state-owned oil company there wanted to take control of the operations of the facility. They were much more involved in the construction process and just very much an active player, where I would say the state-owned oil company in Peru was more hands-off.
Now, one of the things that I've heard from a couple other guests is when you're dealing with these state-owned entities, not only do they own the entity itself, the gas, oil company, whatever it may be, they also are in charge of the environmental agencies as well. So how has that worked out for you in maybe Peru or Colombia or some of these other nations where it's the government who is kind of in charge of both entities and wanting the project done, and then you're battling the government itself to get the project done?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So from that perspective, my experience with the state-owned companies that I've worked with, it's actually not a lot different than the U.S. in that there's enough of a firewall between the state-owned oil company and then the separate government entities going through regulatory compliance and environmental permitting, where you would think that because the government is sort of in charge of all these separate entities, that there'd be a little bit more coordination, but there's not. so
Right.
so you can be on the same page, like in the U.S. We can be on the same page with an ExxonMobil or a Shell or whoever is the owner on a project, and then we're just butting heads with whatever regulators or environmental permitting agencies. We're having to jump through every single loophole with them that we would jump through in a country where there's a state-owned oil company.
Do you find the permitting process to be longer in these countries, or is it about the same as it is here in the U.S.?
I would say that it's very, very country specific and not necessarily tied to whether it's a national oil company or a private oil company. I mean, and also very industry specific. In the U.S., for instance, and also in Canada, it takes forever to get an LNG project permitted. In a country like Peru or Papua New Guinea, much shorter. Likewise, it's a much faster to get a petrochemical facility permitted in the U.S. than it is in Peru. So I think it's a lot more dependent on the specific country and the specific product line within oil and gas.
Okay, staying with the environmental theme for just one more second here. In South Africa, one of the complaints I've heard is that they consider themselves a developing nation. However, their environmental regulatory practices are as stringent as the U.S., and so it kind of hinders their ability to do these projects where they have to meet these demands. They have blackouts, and they have a percentage of the population who doesn't have power, and yet they're trying to go through what their version of the EPA is to get these projects done. And it's not, and then you bring in, like you said, you have this workforce that's not necessarily always trained in the way they need to be trained. And so you've got all these factors, and then the environmental agency is as stringent as it is here in the U.S. And so you're dealing with all these obstacles. Has that been your experience in other places, or is that maybe just a South African problem?
I think that's more specialized to South Africa. And then I would say I would also question, which regulations specifically are the problem? Because if you have a workforce that isn't as qualified, that doesn't necessarily affect what your ultimate emissions output needs to be. Now, if you're getting into volumes and volumes and volumes and volumes on social responsibility and social compliance standards, then sometimes that again is not a function of the country regulatory bodies, but sometimes even a function of the lenders. Where you're getting your money. For instance, like if I'm doing a project in South Africa, sometimes whether it's environmental regulation or social responsibility regulation, I'm bound by what my lender's standards are, which are often World Bank or IPCA standards. So I think that if there's something going on in South Africa, that it's probably pretty specific to South Africa in that regard.
Okay, good deal. The next thing I want to go to is safety. Obviously, here in the States, if you clip a fingernail, you got to file some kind of report. What are the safety standards internationally that you've seen? Are they comparable to the States? Because a lot of the times I hear people that consider going to work internationally, but they're a little afraid of what kind of safety conditions they may get into.
So I would say that on a national level, there countries, developing nations and emerging markets definitely don't have the same safety standards as the U.S. But I think that if you go to work for a country whose base is in the U.S. or they're incorporated in a from a developed nation, that they're going to impose that their company safety standards. So just as a for instance, while I work for CB&I, CB&I imposes our safety standards on every single project that we do around the world, and those are U.S. safety standards. So we impose those no matter where we're working in the world. Now, if you go and you work for a Peruvian subcontractor in Peru, chances are their safety standards are not going to be what a U.S. company's safety standards are.
We'll get back with Aaron in a second, but first, let's hear from our sponsor.
For over 20 years, R Squared Global has served the energy and infrastructure industries. With offices in Texas, Alabama, and Louisiana, R Squared Global offers engineering, survey, right-of-way, and GIS solutions. For more information, please visit www.gor2.com.
And now let's return to our interview with guest Aaron Drucker. Okay, great. Well, let's transition into the dollar side of things. Here in the U.S., if you're talking about Enterprise or Kinder Morgan or something like that, you've got a CEO who's running the company, and they've got the stockholders are reporting to, and they're trying to make profit for the company. What is the dynamic of these state-owned companies? How are they working, and who is receiving the money? Where is it going? How does that work?
So let me try to take apart that question a little bit. So again, it's very, very country specific. Most of the money that an NOC or a state-owned company will get goes into some sort of a sovereign wealth fund, and that sovereign wealth fund is distributed in some way back to the population. So in the case of Statoil in Norway and Saudi sovereign wealth fund are probably the world's two most famous. So they redistribute that money either in part directly to their population, but then also through government funded programs that benefit their population.
Okay, and so the follow up to that would be is, here in the states, we're going to look for corruption. We want our companies to be profitable, obviously, and you do have these shareholders that you're going to be accountable to, or if you're a private owned business, then you got yourself that's kind of trying to make the profit. Who is holding these companies accountable to make sure that they are, trying to make a profit for the people to get back this state owned money that's been earned through these projects they're doing?
Again, it's so country specific, but normally there's some sort of a congressional body that reviews the national oil companies' budgets and cash flows and balance sheet, more or less.
Okay, and so one of the themes here I'm hearing from you is it's country specific. So let's kind of stop here for a second, kind of break down just some of the varieties that you might see in the different countries on how they may operate. Just over some of these past few questions that you may say, okay, well, I was here in Australia and I saw this, or I was here in Colombia and I saw this. Just to kind of maybe spread out these answers and go, okay, these countries did it these different ways, and here's some examples of that.
Okay. So in the case of Colombia, their Congress and also their central government had different boards and subcommittees that would review Ecopetrol's business, more or less. So they would have, I want to say that they would report quarterly, just like a typical publicly held company would report. And so, I mean, the congressional subcommittees would go through, what they were spending their money on, and the funny thing is with them is that they actually did have a lot of detail. There was a lot of concern about what money, how they were actually spending their money. So they had everything down to, literally, what were 2-inch flanges costing them, and the congressional subcommittees would review, that sort of a detail, and they would audit that detail and audit why it cost them $6 for a 2-inch flange.
So they're acting as if, like we would think here in the States, is like, the board would act, or, maybe a really invested stockholder here stateside, and kind of reviewing and holding the company accountable in that manner, correct?
Absolutely. And they would get third-party auditors involved in the same way that a company here would. They'd get one of the big five to audit all of their financials.
So what would you say, and you can pick any country if it's helpful here, what have been some of the pros that you've seen of the state-owned companies, or is there been any pros that you've seen you said that maybe we should look at here stateside?
I wouldn't say that there's that many pros of a state-owned oil company. I would just say that some state-owned oil companies perform better than others in terms of what level of detail they get concerned about, and also how they actually spend their money. But those sorts of pros and cons can apply to the private oil companies of the world as well. So I don't know that there's that many pros and cons that are specific to state-owned oil companies. Just that some as a contractor, you always want any oil company, any owner to be focused on what they should be focused on, and not getting bogged down in details that they don't need to be involved in.
So what is the future of the state-owned oil company, or the gas company for that matter, when we have, we're in a oil glut and we've got natural gas that's coming out of our ears? Will they be able to sustain themselves over the next 10, 20 years, or will we have to see something more like the U.S. model where you have large oil and gas companies and you have small oil and gas companies, and they're all trying to make it work on different economic factors, because obviously a smaller company can have less overhead and a larger one can have more overhead and all these different things. Will the state-owned oil and gas company be viable 10, 15, 20 years down the road?
I think a state-owned oil company will be viable. I just think that that some of them will have to change how they act. Again, it's good corporate governance is good corporate governance, regardless of whether it's a state-owned oil company or a private oil company. So, the situation in Saudi Arabia, where I think everybody's pretty aware of Aramco trying to go out for an IPO. It's because they need additional capital because they're running out of money, because they haven't been they haven't been good custodians of their money. But you have a situation like Statoil, where the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is one of the most well-run funds in the world. I think they own 1% of all world equities. So, I think that you'll just have to have some of these state-owned oil companies that haven't done so well, maybe trying to model some of the state-owned oil companies that have done better.
But let me just push back on that a little bit, and let's just go to Saudi Arabia. Could you say that
Sure.
for the Saudi Aramco and all the IPO reports I've seen as well, could you say, though, if Saudi Arabia were to allow a multitude of oil and gas investors to come in and to try to develop their reserves, that maybe that would work better than the Saudi Aramco model, no matter how efficient Saudi Aramco ran, because all of a sudden you have new ideas and you have different technologies that are being brought into play, whereas Saudi Aramco, they're so large, it's going to be harder for them to adopt and to go up and down with the market, whereas these other companies are coming a little bit more lean, a little bit more faster, and be more efficient in the long run.
Yeah, I think that's a possibility. Sure. I mean, I think that you could. I mean, no one company is perfect. So no one company is going to be able to run the entire industry within a sovereign nation by themselves perfectly. So yeah, anytime that you bring in smaller companies to get in their ideas and get their efficiencies, I think that could help. But again, whether or not that those companies would come in and function like smaller companies in the U.S. where they own all of their resources, et cetera, I don't know that Aramco necessarily needs to do that. But yeah, and anytime you have a diversity of ideas, it's going to be better.
Let's talk about this for a second. One of the things here in the States that we're used to hearing about is leasing and going through the leasing process, and there's a new play and there's landmen out there. Internationally, what do you see when you go to these different countries? Do the citizens own the mineral rights? I know in some they don't, but in these ones that you've been in, is it normal for the citizens to have mineral rights, or is that kind of a country-by-country situation?
It's definitely a country-by-country situation. I could say that in the countries that I've worked, that the U.S. is the only country where you have individual mineral rights. So otherwise, the state owns all the mineral rights, and each company is leasing from the state.
Okay, and so when you look the next phase, as you think about it, leasing gives you the right to pull your units and all this stuff, and then you can drill your wells, and eventually you got to lay a pipeline, which gets you into condemnation, expropriation. How does that work in these different nations when the state is trying to develop its own assets and it needs to get these pipelines built? Do you see a fair negotiation process, or is it a little bit more in favor of the government because they own the whole process?
I think that you see a fair process, again, depending on the country, just because you'll have different state-owned entities that control each part of that process that don't necessarily get along, right? So you'll have different state-owned entities that will do the leasing, and they essentially are in charge of the management of the resources themselves. And then you'll have a different state-owned entity that will do the midstream, and you'll have a different one that will do downstream processing or whatever it is they're doing with the oil and gas once it gets to where it's going. So You almost see that. You almost see competition between those entities.
Well, it's good to know that it's not just our government that can't get along with itself. It's all these other governments as well.
Yeah, yeah. No. Trust is as sad as it may be. I actually do think that our government is one of the better well-run governments in the world.
So I want to shift just a little bit now until we were talking before we got on here about LNGs and I think you got a trip coming up. You mentioned, what is the current state of LNG and where is that heading over the next few years?
Well, to tell you the truth, I think that really I think we're in a global supply glut right now. So I hear all these different things about how you need to start developing projects now because it takes 8 years to develop an LNG project. So if you have a demand rebound in 2022 or 2023, then that means you have to be developing the projects now. But I would say that there's about 45 MTPA worth of LNG that's on the Gulf Coast right now, where they've done all of the feed design, where if the owners wanted to, they could press the button on their final investment decision today and get started on construction of those projects, and that gas would be available, and certainly by 2022. So, I just think that we're in a supply glut, and I think that it's going to take some time to get out of. I think that there's changes in demand coming from non-traditional players like India and Turkey and Pakistan and Bangladesh, and that demand is now easier to grow because of the cheap cost of floating storage and regasification units as opposed to onshore import facilities. So I think that the LNG market is evolving. I think that demand will catch up to supply eventually in 2022 and 2023. And I think that you're going to see fewer and fewer 15 and 20-year long-term agreements, and you're going to see more and more LNG being traded like you would gas and oil. So approximately 22%, 25% of global LNGs bought at a spot price and traded. So I think by 2023, you're going to see that number pushing closer to, 40, 50%. And I also think that you're going to see us getting closer to regional gas pricing, global regional gas pricing, as opposed to specific market gas pricing.
Well, that's interesting stuff there because it's one thing I love about the energy sector is there's always stuff that's moving and changing, and it takes a multitude of people just to kind of halfway get your pulse on what's going on. And so I want to leave you with this question here. So someone who's maybe just in college, getting out of college, and they're looking to get into the oil and gas industry, and they look around, they go, everywhere I see, there's supply glut. It's just supply, and no one is predicting, at least any people I've listened to, that's turning around anytime soon. Where would you focus a young person to get into this industry and say, hey, I would bet on this horse over the next 10 to 15 years to start your career? And that could be stateside, internationally, wherever.
Well, first off, I would. Okay, so if we want to go industry specific, I would put my horse on natural gas because as Mark LaCour always says. I know Mark's kind of a friend of the show. Mark always talks about being a fan of all energy, and I'm certainly a fan of all energy, and I think that a lot of the gains that renewable energy has made in the last 5 years. Both in their proliferation and in the coming down of the cost, making it more economic, is great. But natural gas is also rising. The demand is also rising there. I think there's always going to be a steady demand rising with natural gas. So for that, I would for specific industry, that's what I would focus on. And within that, I guess I'll go ahead and and use the buzzword of the day, but like data analytics, I see that more and more both on the E&P side and on the downstream side and on the contractor side. People wanting access to people that know how to make sense of the data and the numbers.
And
that's the biggest thing.
And that's really encouraging because, as younger guys ourselves, the last 10 years, it seems like you're always battling, and I'm not a big data analytics guy, but just the technology that we use is like, okay, there's some technological things we could do here that would smooth this process out. And so to hear this kind of coming of, hey, we're going to get more technological savvy, it is encouraging because it's been frustrating at some points over my career just to kind of get some simple technology implemented on some of the projects I've worked on.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. And it's funny, the LNG projects are multi-billion-dollar projects, and so when we're going through our reviews for these projects, there's a lot of widgets that make up $6 billion, right?
Right.
And you're comparing all your different numbers of widgets and comparing this number of widgets to that number of widgets, and you're trying to make sense of this number. And the truth is that we have so much data now. It's absolutely ridiculous. It's making sense of the data. It's knowing what data actually matters and why it matters. So again, any young person that wants to come in and try to add value in that area, I think the sky's the limit.
Well, we will leave with this. You mentioned Mark Drucker. Yes, he's been on the show. He's actually our first guest, and he's who introduced me and you. And he introduced us because there may be talks of another podcast in the works, and so hopefully we can pull that off. I enjoyed the discussion today, and we will get a little bit better at it as we go on and figure this thing out. And so hopefully we can get that. No pressure to you, Mark, but we are kind of calling you out publicly here. And so hopefully we can get that done here in the next month or so and get to work on that, which will be a separate podcast from this one, and it will focus more on oil and gas related type projects and stuff like that. So Aaron, I look forward to hopefully getting that deal done and working with you on that. And thank you for coming on. It was helpful for me and hopefully for the audience to kind of wade through some of this stuff and get some perspective. And we look to talk to you again in the future.
That sounds great. Thanks a lot for having me, Ryan. It was a lot of fun. Great discussion, and hopefully we'll get the chance to do this many more times in the future.
Aaron, thanks again for coming on. I know you're an extremely busy guy, and so we really appreciate it. And so as we mentioned towards the end, there is some talk of Aaron and I doing another podcast that we would co-host, and I actually ran into our good friend Mark Drucker as I'm recording this, which would have been yesterday, January 12th. This will be released a week later. And Mark said that it is in the works and it is possible, so stay tuned for that. We'll keep you up to date. And Mark, here is more public pressure to give the people what they want. Final reminders. If you haven't, rate and review in iTunes, we'd appreciate it. And on that note, we had a review from the Nemesis, and the Nemesis called us out, and he said it's a good show, but he would like to hear more renewables. Well, guess what? We have recorded an interview with a guy in renewables, solar energy, that'll be coming out the 1st of February. So stay tuned for that, Nemesis, and we appreciate your review and everyone else that's reviewed the show so far. Final thing here, check out the show notes. All the information's there. How you can get in contact with me, how you can get in contact with Aaron, and everything else you need to know. Guys, it's awesome that you're listening to us. We really appreciate it. And until next time, keep climbing.
Thanks for listening to the Global Energy Leaders Podcast, powered by R2 Global.